Hello and welcome to an installment of Church Vitality in the Mitten State. I am your host and your Associate Conference Minister for Church Vitality and Transitions, Lawrence Richardson. Today, I have the wonderful privilege and opportunity to sit down with our wonderful conference minister, the Reverend Dr. Lillian Daniel, and we're just going to get right into it because I know that you all would prefer to hear from her more so than me at this point because we're all so excited about what she has to share. So let's just jump right into it. Lillian, how can we most faithfully be a politically diverse church in this time when really we have just as many churches on a far left end of a spectrum as we do on the far right, and some folks that are in the middle?
In some ways, I'll push back right there. I'm not sure that we have just as many churches in the different political camps. If we did, it would almost be easier. But for any denomination or any local church, it generally leans one way or the other. And that's the rub. You can't just go 50-50. So knowing that, I think, is important for church leaders, for clergy, but then not being driven by that and really trying to preach from the gospel, trying to preach from the Bible. Let the Bible be your guide, not the news the night before.
So I want to dovetail on that because I think that's really important. It brings some perspective that our little bubble might not always be representative of the larger society or even the larger conference. And so when we think about some of the innovative ways that people have adapted to church as church is changing and as society and technology continues to innovate and progress, when you think about worship and technology, what are churches advertising these days?
Well, I think a lot of our churches, if you look at the videos of their worship, are advertising that they have no one there. And that's a decision to make. What do you show on your video? In some cases, I'll go to those churches in person and I'll discover that there are actually a lot of people there, but there are snakes on the front pews. And that's what shows up in the video. And you know what I mean? There might as well be snakes on the front pews because people don't want to sit there. So that's the first thing I would say is before you stress about the content, even, what are you projecting into the world? And if your sanctuary has a view where the camera includes nobody in the congregation, just move the camera closer so that it's on the preacher. But think, really carefully what you're transmitting and how just from the first look.
So, Lillian, in the wider church and certainly in our conference and in other denominations, there are questions about leadership and what it means to develop leaders in this time. Can you speak to what leadership development means for us today?
Everybody says they want leadership development in our churches, and I believe them. But just like every congregation I've ever served has said, we want our church to have a Bible study. And what I've learned the hard way is I should have worded the question, do you personally, Lawrence Richardson, want to attend a Bible study? Because these are very subjective things. And my worst nightmare working in a denomination where we really see ourselves in service to our churches and to our pastors, my worst nightmare is that we're answering questions that nobody is asking. Unfortunately, I think a lot of denominations will fall into that trap. So, how do we avoid it? We have to be out there in the churches. We have to be out there talking to the pastors. And often that's easier to do than it is to talk to the lay leaders. So, I'm constantly trying to figure out how do I break through that pastor bottleneck, if you will, and get to talk to the lay leaders in the churches. So when I go visit a church, I'll do a deep dive visit on Zoom before I ever go to the church in person. But I always ask if a group of key lay people can meet with me before worship also. And I'll often ask them to give me a tour of the church, which is fascinating. Things come out about what they need, what they want, what they miss while you're walking around that building. You learn things you never knew. And then it's my job to come back to you and our staff and say, what are they asking for, or what do they not know that they're asking for? What's the question or the problem, and how can we bring in a resource?
Speaking of resources, there are some realities that communities, whether in rural parts of our state or in the city or in some small towns, that resources are scarce, and in some areas resources are in abundance. And so, how can we talk about some of the challenges that people are facing? Without spiraling into further political and cultural divides.
I don't think any of our churches are swimming in resources. Honestly, I don't. Even in wealthy communities, I think the world of giving and generosity has changed, and I don't think any of our churches feel flush. So let's start there. And then I want to recognize that you get people from different churches together, particularly in a place like Michigan, where the economic divide, the technological divide is so massive. Michigan is fascinating to me. We have our big cities, our suburbs, our rural communities. We have towns that are decimated by the loss of factories and jobs, and they might be 4 miles away from a town that has a booming tourism industry, but where the people working in tourism can't afford to live. It's filled with mansions and vacation homes of people from Chicago or Detroit or whatnot. And this is just the reality, I think. And you can't assume based on where you are on a map what people are experiencing economically. That's just really important. And it's really important for us in the church, lay leaders, people working on making a case for why you should give to the church, to check all of their assumptions. It's a very weird economic landscape right now.
As we come to the conclusion of our time together, is there anything else, any other nugget of wisdom or insight that you want to leave for us today?
Actually, I want to come back to technology and say this. While there are a million ways to do it incorrectly, the biggest mistake would be not to have anything. And every church, I don't care how small you are, if you would like new people to come, they're going to check you out online and they're going to see what's happening there. So you have to have some presence. And honestly, it doesn't have to be perfect every time, but you've got to have a few examples up there because it's the front door these days. It honestly is. And then speaking of front doors, I have to go on my favorite pet peeve, which is what is the front door to your church and how do people get in? I wish every church would get friends who are not from this place and just let them loose to try to figure out how to get into the building and to narrate their experience as they go for it. Because so many of our churches say, well, everybody knows you come in the back way, and then you clamber over these old signs, from the Christmas pageant in 1965, and you're coming in like through the basement of a funeral home. And for the newcomer, even the signs people put up make no sense. So just think a lot about that front door. And then once you've thought about the front door, I mean, obviously the most important thing is what happens inside. And this is where I think we do need leadership development all the time. For me, for you, for anybody standing up there and leading worship. What are we doing and why? The world has got a very short attention span. And if they come out in person for anything, it's got to be meaningful. And sometimes I think in COVID, well, this was the case for me. I'll just pick on myself. I watched our worship videos and I found myself fast forwarding through 40% of it. And I thought, now I created this stuff. Like I should, but just to see it with different eyes and then to say what words that we're saying today are essential and could only be said or heard in this holy and sacred place. And what's a bunch of noise?
Conference Minister, thank you so much for your time, for this opportunity to sit down with you. We have come to the end of this Church Vitality in the Mitten State video. We are so grateful for your time and attention today and for your contributions and support to the Michigan Conference United Church of Christ through our basic support of our church's wider mission. We thank you for the ability to be present in this time as we are all the church together. Until next time, we will see you soon.
Amen. Peace be with you.